Chapter 19 of Gossip in a Library. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Eugene Smith. Gossip in a Library by Edmund Gosse. Chapter 19. The Natural History of Selborne. The Natural History and Antiquities of Selborne in the County of Southampton, with engravings and an appendix. London, printed by T. Bensley for B. White and Son, at Horace's Head, Fleet Street, 1789. It is not always the most confidently conducted books, or those best preceded by blasts on the public trumpet, which are eventually received with highest honours into the palace of literature. No more curious incident of this fact is to be found than is presented by the personal history of that enchanting classic, White's Selborne. If ever an author hesitated and reflected, dipped his toe into the bath of publicity, and hastily withdrew it again, loitered on the brink, and could not be induced to plunge, it was the Reverend Gilbert White. This man of singular genius was not to be persuaded that the town would tolerate his lucubrations. He was ready to make a present of them to anyone who would father them. He allowed his life to slip by until his 70th year was reached before he would print them, and when they appeared, he could not find the courage to put his name on the title page. Not one of his own titlarks or sedge warblers could be more shy of public observation. Even the fact that his own brother was a publisher gave him no real confidence in printers' ink. Gilbert White was already a middle-aged man when he was drawn into correspondence by Thomas Pennant, a naturalist younger than himself, who had undertaken to produce, in 4 volumes folio, a work on British zoology, for the production of which he was radically unfitted. It has been severely but justly pointed out that wherever Pennant rises superior, either in style or information, to his own dead level of pompous inexactitude, he is almost certainly quoting from a letter of Gilbert White's. Yet no acknowledgment of the Selborne parson is vouchsafed. Even in the account of the harvest mouse, says Professor Bell, there is no mention of its discoverer. Nevertheless, so rudimentary was scientific knowledge 130 years ago, that Pennant's pretentious book was received with acclamation. The patient man at Selborne sat and smiled, even courteously joining with mild congratulations in the rounds of applause. Fortunately, Pennant did not remain his only correspondent. The Honourable Daines Barrington was a man of another stamp, not profound, indeed, but enthusiastic, a genuine lover of research, and a gentleman at heart. He quoted Gilbert White in his writings, but never without full acknowledgment. Other friends followed, and the recluse of Selborne became the correspondent of Sir Joseph Banks, of Dr. Chandler, and of many other great ones of that day, now decently forgotten. Meanwhile, he was growing old. Any sharp winter might have cut him off as he trudged along through the deep lanes of his rustic parish. Early in 1770, Daines Barrington, tired of seeing his friend the mere valet to so many other pompous intellects, had proposed to him to draw up an account of the animals of Selborne. Gilbert White put the fascinating notion from him. It is no small undertaking, he replied, for a man unsupported and alone to begin a natural history from his own autopsia. Pennant seems to have joined in the suggestion of Barrington, for White says, in a letter dated July 19, 1771, which did not see the light for more than a century after it was written, As to any publication in this way of my own, I look upon it with great diffidence, finding that I ought to have begun it 20 years ago. But if I was to attempt anything, it should be something of a natural history of my native parish, an annus historico naturalis, comprising a journal of 1 whole year, and illustrated with large notes and observations. Such a beginning might induce more able naturalists to write the history of various districts, and might in time occasion the production of a work so much to be wished for, a full and complete natural history of these kingdoms." 3 years later, he was still thinking of doing something, but putting off the hour of action. In 1776, he was suddenly spurred to decide by the circumstance that Barrington had written to propose a joint work on natural history. "If I publish at all," said Gilbert White to his nephew, "I shall come forth by myself." In 1780 he is still unready. "Were it not for want of a good amanuensis, I think I should make more progress." He was now 60 years of age. 8 years later he was preparing the Index, and at last, in the autumn of 1789, the volume positively made its appearance in the maiden author's 70th year. Few indeed, if any, among English writers of high distinction have been content to delay so long before testing the popular estimate of their work. His book was warmly welcomed, but the delightful author survived its publication less than 4 years, dying in the parish which he was to make so famous. Gilbert White was, in a very peculiar sense, a man of one book. Countless as have been the reprints of the Natural History of Selborne, its original form is no longer, perhaps, familiar to many readers. The first edition, which is now before me, is a very handsome quarto. Benjamin White, the publisher, who was the younger brother of Gilbert, issued most of the standard works on natural history which appeared in London during the second half of the century, and his experience enabled him to do adequate justice to the History of Selborne. The frontispiece is a large folding plate of the village from Short Lythe, an ambitious summer landscape, representing the church, White's own house, and a few cottages against the broad sweep of the Hanger. On a terrace in the foreground are portrait figures of 3 gentlemen standing, and a lady seated. Of the former, one is a clergyman, and it has often been stated that this is Gilbert White himself, erroneously, since no portrait of him was ever executed. That discovered in 1913 has yet to prove that it represents Gilbert White in any way. The figure is that of Reverend Robert Yalden, vicar of Newton Valence. The frontispiece is unsigned, and I find no record of the artist's name. It is not to be doubted, however, that the original was painted by Samuel Hieronymus Grimm, a Swiss watercolour draftsman, who sketched so many topographical views in the south of England. The remaining illustrations to this first edition are an oval landscape vignette on the title page, engraved by Daniel Lerpiniere, a full-page plate of some fossil shells, an extra-sized plate of the Himantopus that was shot at Frensham Pond, straddling with an immense excess of shank, and 4 engravings, now of remarkable interest, displaying the village as it then stood from various points of view. They are engraved by Peter Mazel, after drawings of Grimm's, and give what is evidently a most accurate impression of what Selborne was a century ago. In these days of reproductions, it is rather strange that no publisher has issued facsimiles of these beautiful illustrations to the original edition of what has become one of the most popular English works. For the use of book collectors, I may go on to say that anyone who is offered a copy of the edition of the History of Selborne of 1789 should be careful to see that not merely the plates I have mentioned are in their places, but that the engraved subtitle, with a print of the seal of Selborne Priory, occurs opposite the blank leaf which answers to page 306. It is impossible for a bibliographer who writes on Gilbert White to resist the pleasure of mentioning the name of his best editor and biographer. It was unfortunate that Thomas Bell, who was born 8 months before the death of Gilbert White, and who, quite early in life, began to entertain an enthusiastic reverence for that writer, did not find an opportunity of studying Selborne on the spot until the memories of White were becoming very vague and scattered there. I think it was not until about 1865 that, retiring from a professional career, he made Selborne and the Wakes, the very house of Gilbert White, his residence. Here he lived, however, for 15 years, and here it was his delight to follow up every vestige of the great naturalist's sojourn in the parish. White became the passion of Professor Bell's existence, and I well recollect him when he was 85 or 86 years of age, and no longer strong enough in body to quit his room with ease, sitting in his armchair at the bedroom window, and directing my attention to points of whitish interest, as I stood in the garden below. It was as difficult for Mr. Bell to conceive that his annotations of White were complete, as it had been for White himself to pluck up courage to publish, and it was not until 1877, when the author was 85 years of age, that his great and final edition, in 2 thick volumes, was issued. He lived, however, to be nearly 90, and died in the Wakes at last, in the very room, and if I mistake not, the very spot in the room where his idol had passed away in 1793. As long as Professor Bell was alive, the house preserved, in all essentials, the identical character which it had maintained under its famous tenant. Overgrown with creepers to the very chimneys, divided by the greenest and most velvety of lawns from the many-coloured furnace of flower-beds, scarcely parted by lush paddocks from the intense green wall of the coppiced hill, the Wakes has always retained, for my memory, an impression of rural fecundity and summer glow absolutely unequalled. The garden seemed to burn like a green sun, with crimson stars and orange meteors to relieve it. All, I believe, has since then been altered. Selborne, they tell me, has ceased to bear any resemblance to that rich nest in which Thomas Bell so piously guarded the idea of Gilbert White. If it be so, we must live content with, quote, the memory of what has been, and never more may be. End of chapter 19.